Hello and welcome to the Political History of the United States. Episode 4.37, Reacting to Independence. A decade after the beginning of the imperial crisis, and more than a year after the outbreak of the war, what was once unthinkable had become a reality. The colonies had declared their independence from Great Britain and had formed a new entity called the United States of America. Declaring independence had been something of an inevitability for some months now. Yet that did not stop there from being powerful reactions throughout the states and beyond to the newly declared independence. This week, we are going to explore the spread of the news of the Declaration and the response that followed in its wake. It was 4 days after the document was finalized that the population would first hear it read aloud. The first reading on July 8th in Philadelphia was met with celebration. This was generally how the Declaration was accepted throughout the states. On July 9th, the American forces would hear the Declaration read by their officers as they stood in formation. It had been quickly decided that the Declaration was a document to be read aloud. It was John Hancock writing to George Washington, telling him that Congress wished for the Declaration to be read to the men by the officers, which is exactly how it took place. For much of the military, they would first hear the Declaration read while stationed in New York, where Howe's army was now visible off the coast. We will return in a bit to Howe's looming army. However, it is also worth noting that the initial reading in New York came before that state's delegation officially approved the Declaration, which, as we know from last time, would not come until July 15th. What would follow over the next several weeks were public readings in towns all throughout the former colonies. By the middle part of August, the news had reached all the way south to Georgia. As we saw in Philadelphia, there was a general sense of celebration following the first reading. The Declaration spread throughout the states in a couple of different ways. The most common is the previously mentioned public readings. Following the signing, Congress had multiple copies of the Declaration printed by Philadelphia printer John Dunlap. These broadsides were spread throughout the states and have since become the most well-recognized method by which the Declaration was spread. Newspapers likewise became a popular format for the reproduction of the Declaration. For many, the Declaration of Independence was welcome because it finally, officially, clarified just what they were all doing. The war had been going on for more than a year now. For just about everybody, there had been significant hardships. Even if you were not directly involved in the fighting, there were shortages of staple items and a general economic downturn that came with the decline in trade. Finally, though, there was again that clarification in what it was they were doing, why they were fighting. Sure, the answer might have seemed inevitable for a while, that independence was the path that they were all on. However, now Congress had caught up with what everybody already knew was coming, and made it official. What followed was a period where, in the support of the Declaration, an anti-George III movement spread everywhere. We have talked before about the fact that opinion was slow to turn on the monarch. The vast majority of the imperial crisis had seen the colonists focus their energies on Parliament and not George III. Even after the fighting broke out, there remained a, albeit shrinking faction that continued to petition George III for redress. It was not really until the beginning of 1776 that you see widespread denunciations of George III. The Declaration of Independence was not a divorce from Parliament. Jefferson intentionally ignored that Parliament ever had legitimacy over the colonists, instead focusing his energies on the monarchy. This means that as the Declaration spread throughout the states, popular energy quickly shifted to removing all vestiges of George III, which, as it would turn out, were everywhere. Colonists took to destroying every image and vestige of their former king. From coffee houses to taverns to courthouses, government buildings, and even throughout churches, George III was there. He was everywhere. Crowds made quick work of this imagery and proved quite adept at it. The images were smashed to pieces and thrown into large bonfires to the general approval of the crowds. No reaction was more dramatic, nor more well-known, than the response in New York. There, local patriots, with the assistance from slaves, tore down a statue of George III located at Broadway and Bowling Green. Once on the ground, the crowd beheaded the statue, before stringing the now disfigured head up on a flagpole. After a bit of time to let that all sink in, the remainders of the toppled statue were shipped to Litchfield, Connecticut, where they were melted down, the lead collected, and repurposed into around 40,000 musket balls. In Long Island, an effigy of George III was created, hung from a makeshift gallows, and then burnt. Although a bit less dramatic, in Georgia there was a mock funeral held for the king. Regardless of the specific acts taking place throughout the states, it was clear from their actions that the citizenry was ready to move on from their now former monarch. Although there was certainly widespread acceptance of the Declaration, it was by no means universally beloved. After all, there were still plenty of people who were more than ready to throw their hands up and cry foul at the allegations being leveled by Jefferson. Amongst the loudest of these voices of opposition to the Declaration was, as we began discussing last time, Thomas Hutchinson. Hutchinson, now living in London, wrote in his response that it really did not matter what allegations Jefferson levied against the crown, because independence had always been a solution in search of a problem. What Hutchinson was arguing is that there had always been a group of colonists in each colony that was determined to produce independence well before 1776. The imperial crisis, therefore, had been nothing more than that necessary problem to achieve the preconceived end of independence. He argued that beginning with the collapse of Canada, there had been a devout clique determined to bring about independence. Hutchinson stated that it was this small group of men who had managed to steer the whole of North America away from being devout and loyal subjects, and had pushed them into the camp of being rebels. Well, Hutchinson's ire is somewhat understandable. Let's not forget how he had been treated in the colonies. You did not have to travel across the Atlantic to find critics of the Declaration. Within the states there remained a large number of loyalists who were eager to make their voices heard. Much closer to home, men like Joseph Galloway expressed feelings similar to Hutchinson's. Galloway argued that independence had always been the plan, and that George III and his government were right not to cave into American demands. These conspiracies went further to suggest that the American Whigs were involved with opposition parties back in London, and that this entire thing had been orchestrated from the beginning. These arguments would eventually grow enough to begin to pull some strange people into their orbit, including the suggestion that the lack of military success by General William Howe implicated him in the greater conspiracy. Is it possible that there is any truth to the allegations of Hutchinson or Galloway, that there was some great conspiracy? Though impossible to conclusively say, widespread popular support for independence really doesn't begin until late in 1775, heading into 1776. Although it seems reasonable that there were people in the colonies, well in advance of the outbreak of violence, that would have sought independence from the crown. Nothing I have seen suggests that this was a terribly active group. What seems much more reasonable, again from what I've seen, is that there was a group in the colonies as early as 1754 that would have been interested in having an independent parliament, while still maintaining loyalty to the monarch. The Albany Plan, even being suggested, provides the evidence on that front. However, the Albany Plan was always meant to be something that functioned inside the empire, and not as an object to remove the colonies from it. Even after the outbreak of fighting, we know that opposition to independence remained strong. Recall that John Adams, somebody who was certainly in favor of independence, decided to go ahead and not oppose the Olive Branch petition, because he understood that moving for independence in the summer of 1775 was a step too far for many. Either way, the foundations for objections to the Declaration found themselves predicated upon the idea of a grand conspiracy that had formed prior to the imperial crisis itself. Initial responses aside, today in the United States we revere the Declaration. It is one of the most central and celebrated documents in the history of the United States. Certainly in 1776 it caught the attention of people. Yet the Declaration would not become the sacred document that we know today until long after the Revolution. Independence was celebrated, to be sure. However, the celebrations were for independence itself, and not for the document that ushered it in. In fact, the Declaration itself was largely ignored and forgotten about in the years following its drafting. I want to take just a minute to discuss this and to talk about the immediate legacy of the Declaration, because it is a bit of an interesting evolution. After the initial spread of the Declaration of Independence during the summer of 1776, the document largely fell out of vogue. Independence was celebrated, but the Declaration was simply the vehicle by which it was achieved. It was not really celebrated or even mentioned in its own right. The fact is, the Declaration of Independence was not the document that we hold in such high regard today. Rather, it was news, with the conclusion of independence being the part that really mattered to the people. The arguments made in the Declaration were nothing new after all, but rather were a rehashing of arguments that by 1776 were all well known to everybody. As historian Philip Detweiler states, if you look at the significant political documents of the 1770s and the 1780s, the Declaration is seldom quoted, with the Virginia Declaration of Rights being the far more often cited work. In fact, it was not until 1848 that any state, Wisconsin, would cite the Declaration in their own state constitution. The Declaration was scarcely spoken of during the debates for the federal constitution, and in the Federalist Papers gets only a single mention by James Madison in Federalist 40. Things did not get better during the 1790s or into the early 1800s either. Today there is something of a popular feeling that the founders were a unified group, that were all working together towards the perceived greater good. Of course, we know from what we've done thus far that this was never the case. The founders were politicians, and like all politicians throughout all of history, they often disagreed with each other. We will dive much more into this next season as we look at the early republic. However, the rise of political parties would do little to help improve the status of the Declaration. With Thomas Jefferson finding himself deeply immersed in party politics, his opponents were not about to sing the praises of anything that he had touched. The 1790s would likewise prove a fraught time for the popularity of the Declaration, as the young nation stood at a crossroads with their relationship towards both France and Great Britain. The Federalists generally took a more favorable view towards the British, and sought to prioritize the restoration and normalization of trade with Britain, whereas men like Jefferson continued to advocate for French interests and a closer relationship between those two nations. As the United States worked towards the eventual Jay Treaty, a celebration of the Declaration, a document calling out the abuses of Great Britain, would have made little diplomatic sense to celebrate. Further complicating the situation was when the French Revolution moved in a decidedly more radical direction during the Reign of Terror, an event that caused a significant amount of skittishness amongst Americans. It was not until the 1820s when we begin to really see a meaningful change in the position of the document amongst Americans. By the 1820s, most of the founding generation had died, and the country was now firmly in the hands of that second generation. Indeed, by the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration, there were only 3 signers still alive: Adams, Jefferson, and Charles Carroll. Adams and Jefferson would not survive the day either, both dying on July 4th, 1826. It was really only as the Declaration moved towards its 50th anniversary that there was a noticeable upswing in attention towards the document, as it became something generally accepted and revered by both parties. This corresponds to a movement during the late 18-teens and into the 1820s, where you would see a dramatic upswing in the popular consciousness to preserve the history of the American Revolutionary era. During these years, there was a marked increase in publications on the matter, and perhaps most famously, John Trumbull's famous painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence would prove exceedingly popular. None of this is to suggest that by the 1820s the meaning of the Declaration of Independence somehow had become set in stone. The Declaration has spent much of its existence being interpreted differently by different groups, meaning different things at different times. We will, of course, spend a very significant amount of time discussing the events mentioned above, though I wanted to cover this today, as I suspect that the legacy of the Declaration itself will seldom appear during these episodes. Though the legacy of the Declaration would change over time, in the days and weeks after independence, there were immediate matters that Congress was going to have to address. Among the paramount reasons stated for the separation from Great Britain was the need to secure foreign alliances. By the end of July, Congress had turned to this task. An alliance in the middle part of the 1770s really meant only one country: France. As we had talked about in detail, France was still licking its wounds from the 7 Years' War, where they had seen their empire significantly reduced in size. There was never really much thought that the French in any way believed in the American cause. Nobody was that delusional. However, the hope was that France might be willing to get involved if they saw an opportunity to mess with the British, and, hopefully, regain some of their lost territory from the French and Indian War. Indeed, even before independence, France was covertly trading with the colonies through the use of a shell company, trading arms for tobacco. So long as the colonies remained loyal to Great Britain, even if in name only, a greater partnership was going to be difficult. However, as of July 4th, that was no longer an issue, and Congress hoped that they could sway the French into a much closer and more meaningful alliance. This was not without some misgivings on the part of the Americans. After all, the Americans had spent the better part of the last 70 years fighting the French in various wars. There was no shortage of bad blood between the Americans and the French, who had, just the previous decade, exerted considerable time, effort, and money in killing the then British Americans. Of course, the situation had now changed, and most people recognized that French help was going to be necessary to winning the war. However, that does not mean that anybody was eager for French troops to be on American soil. The Declaration was not exactly the beginning of American attempts at diplomacy, specifically in regards to the French. In November 1775, there were preliminary steps taken by Congress to open communications with potential allies, and then in March 1776, Congress sent Silas Deane to France to begin working on getting financial and military assistance in place. Although Deane was not the only envoy to be sent out, he did receive the warmest reception of the group. The issue was that often formal acceptance of an envoy would be akin to formal recognition of the rebellious colonies, something which no country was all that eager to do, at least out in the open, during 1776. By May 1776, the French had set up that shell company to begin, covertly, sending weapons to the colonies. On September 26, the United States appointed an official delegation to France, consisting of the previously mentioned Silas Deane, who was now to be joined by Arthur Lee and Benjamin Franklin. Franklin, no longer a young man, was now 70 years old, and his health was not exactly robust. What Franklin brought to the table, however, was really the recognition and celebrity that he already carried. We have been talking about Franklin for a long time now. He was well known throughout Europe. Upon his arrival in France, Franklin played an Oscar-worthy role. He portrayed himself as being the simple homespun farmer. He was able to use this persona to convince the French people that Americans were just that, a hard-working people without pretension. Despite this being the image that Franklin was trying to portray, he was an instant sensation in French society, and quickly became something of a celebrity in Paris. Franklin played off his celebrity to help bring the French people, and hopefully the French court, over to the American side. Although at times Franklin's progress seemed to drag on at an agonizingly slow pace, he understood the game that he was playing better than anybody. Besides securing foreign alliances, independence was also meant to open the opportunity for the colonies to re-establish civil order, by allowing the colonies to enter into a common government with each other. Today we will wrap up with the states working towards that end, and the drafting of the Articles of Confederation. Following independence, Congress approved one delegate from each state to begin the process of creating formal alliances between the states. Quickly, the decision was made that the committee would use the old Albany Plan of Union as their starting point. This is not to suggest that the committee just picked up and dusted off Franklin's old work, but more so that they liked the bones of the document and felt that they could move from there. Immediately, though, there were objections to the very process. Ironically, these objections were coming from Benjamin Franklin. You know, the guy who wrote the plan in the first place. What Franklin was complaining about was the selection of representatives to the drafting committee. As mentioned a moment ago, right now the process was selecting a single delegate from each state. Franklin's objection was that rather than choosing a single representative from each state, that the process should have been based upon the state's populations. I bring this up because this is a bit of foreshadowing to 1787 and the Constitutional Convention. The question over representation that Franklin is bringing up right here is not going to be the last time that we see objections being raised on exactly how to keep representation proportional. Congress formed the committee to draft the Articles of Confederation on June 12, 1776, with John Dickinson at its helm. If unanimity was a prerequisite for independence, no such requirement existed when it came to the Articles of Confederation. Here, all of those old rivalries that we have been talking about for years were thrust to the forefront. All of the states had their own individual wants, as did their delegations. These problems were widespread as well, and were things that did not appear as though they would be easy to overcome. We already know of Franklin's objection over the method of voting, something that he was not alone in. It makes sense that states with larger populations would want to have a larger vote, whereas smaller states were more than happy to have a singular vote per entity. Further foreshadowing future debates over the federal Constitution of 1787, there remained a significant question over the power balance between the individual states and the federal government. Dickinson had recognized this problem early on, and his solution for it was to generally shift power towards the national government and away from the states. The thought by Dickinson is that by moving power to the central government, it would help to stem many of the worst jealousies of the states. There were significant questions before the committee when it came to concerns over issues such as shipping rights, Western lands, and Native American relations. Dickinson believed that by shifting those questions away from the individual states and onto a central government, it would help mollify any one state from acting in a matter that was antithetical to the rest of the Union. Although many of the states were in favor of there being more centralized power, the southern states balked at the idea. Those southern states were quick to accuse the northern states of trying to model the Union after themselves. For the southern states, Their goal was to retain as much power as they could and keep the federal government as small as possible. Unsurprisingly, slavery would wind up at the very core of many of these issues. One such question that came up was how to pay for the war. War is always an expensive endeavor, and at the end of the day, somebody was going to have to foot the bill. The solution that the drafting committee came up with was a simple enough compromise to keep things fair. The war would be paid for by the states in an amount that was tied to the population. This would, at least in theory, keep everything nice and proportional. The problem, and I bet you see where I am going with this, was a question over just who counts towards that population. The northern delegates wanted to count the total population, both free and enslaved alike. Counting the slave population of the South would significantly increase the population and thus the amount of money owed by those states. One proposed idea on how to deal with this came out of Virginia, where it was proposed that 2 slaves count the same as a single freeman. We are still more than a decade away from the Constitutional Convention. However, even now in 1776, the origins of the future 3/5 clause is beginning to form. The debate over the status of slaves also gets to another point that we have discussed previously, that there was a real fear over slave rebellions at the moment, a fear that had been pronounced ever since the proclamation from Dunmore the year before. For those living in the South, this had been at the very core of their lives for over a year now. Historian Robert Parkinson writes in his book, The Common Cause, how this debate was over the creation of that common cause, just as much as it was about the institution of slavery itself. When it came to trying to stitch together a common cause between the states, the fact was that the Southern population had long been living with this fear and anger over the risk of slave rebellion. Therefore, the idea of counting slaves as more than, as Samuel Chase of Maryland would put it, cattle, was completely anathema to most of the Southern population. The initial draft of the articles was completed in the middle part of July 1776. However, what would follow was years of debate and arguments over the document. They would not be fully ratified until 1781, when Maryland became the final state to agree. By the time that the draft was submitted on July 12th, Dickinson was no longer present, having left Congress following his loss over the battle for independence. We will, in time, spend more time looking at the Articles of Confederation and examining how they would come together. The Articles ultimately would prove overly rigid in practice, and would make the government of the new United States grind to a halt. Furthermore, the Articles denied the federal government the ability to levy taxes, something which, in the future, is going to cause a whole lot of people a whole lot of headaches. These are things, however, that we are going to be coming back to in the future, as we watch the United States begin to come to grips with having to accept the role of self-governance. The summer of 1776 was a watershed moment for the colonies. In some ways, nothing had really changed. The war was still in much the same place that it had been months before. The war in Canada had suffered some setbacks, and American forces were being pushed back. In what everybody knew to be the main theater, in New York, everybody was still really just waiting around for General Howe to make his move. Everybody was acutely aware that it was coming, and indeed Howe's ships were visible right off of New York Harbor. But other than playing the waiting game, nothing had actually happened as of yet. What the Declaration of Independence had done, however, was to clarify the intentions of the colonies. That independence was coming was self-evident before July 4th. However, there is still something to be said for making it official. The Declaration had changed the dynamic and had given the government the freedom that they needed to at least attempt to better manage the war. Now they could begin making inroads towards diplomacy and start the work of attempting self-governance. Although independence had now been declared, that ultimately was only one part of the equation. The states could declare their independence all day long, but unless they could back it up with success on the battlefield, it would ring hollow. At the end of the day, what the United States now needed was success in the field, and for George Washington to prove to the rest of the world that backing the United States in the war was a worthwhile venture. Next time, we turn our attention back to the fighting. With General Howe hanging off the coast of New York, it is only a matter of time before another major engagement takes place. Until then, I hope you all have a wonderful 2 weeks. I hope that you are staying healthy and that you are staying safe. And I will see you back here next time as Washington prepares to defend New York.